Okay, we are live. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Omakase Show. For those of you who are not familiar with the Omakase Show, it's a weekly show. We have weekly Twitter Spaces and also webinars when I am the co-host. Also, my name is Elena or Lola, and we are also launching our podcast. And today, actually, we're filming the first version of our podcast. And so I just want to jump into one scene before we start our today's webinar. I will be sharing my screen. So this decision didn't come easy to the Omakase Show, but we just started monetizing for the first time, actually. So if you feel like doing it, you can support our show just by visiting our X and using this scene right here to give us a donation in Ethereum. And so I'm going back to our amazing guest here because once I announced that we are going to have Sasha Stiles, our community was extremely excited. She's a well-known language artist who combines it with technology. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us today. And I would just jump right into it and ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and in general how you got into the Web3.
Sure. Well, thank you so much again for the invitation to join you. It's really nice to see you and always good to have a chat with you and, nice to be here with the whole community as well. So yes, my name's Sasha. I'm a lifelong poet. I'm also a language artist. So a lot of my work has to do with text in different ways. And I've also been working for many years now in the field of AI, doing independent research, really focused in particular on the area of natural language processing and looking at how we can use artificial intelligence to generate text, to make language, and also to sort of understand language in new and different ways. So that's been really important to me in my practice in recent years. I've been working for a while now with AI as a co-author, I would say. I sometimes refer to AI as an alter ego as well that that I adopt from time to time in my work. But I've been writing with AI. Both poetry and also kind of experimenting with other modes of writing. And I can get into some of the process and all that, I think, a little bit later. But for now, just to say it's something that I've really found to be sort of revelatory, using machinic intelligence to sort of augment and amplify my own authorial imagination and intelligence in different ways has been really wonderful. I should say too, I also, I'm one of the co-founders of a collective of poets called the Verse. And we're a group of writers from around the globe who are also, all of us really interested in the potential that new technologies like blockchain, as well as things like AI, offer to us writers. And so we've been, having a lot of fun experimenting and integrating technology into our practices and, sort of helping other writers who might be interested in these fields to learn a little bit more about them, to also be able to, experiment with things like Web3, to start minting poetry on the blockchain for the first time. So all of that has been a really fun journey. And I guess to go back and answer, your question about how specifically, did I find my way here into Web3? Well, I would say, I have been writing about technology and making art about technology for pretty much as long as I can remember. My work has really been focused for many years now on my relationship to my digital devices, my relationship to technology. And a lot of my poetry has to do with kind of grappling with that relationship. And so for a long time, I was publishing poems in more traditional formats. I was writing traditional poetry and publishing them, in literary journals, which is sort of, the go-to channel for most, I think, poets these days. And in 2021, I actually published a physical book of poetry as well as art illustrations. So I've been publishing, in those formats for a long time. But at the same time, I was always experimenting with digital tools, with different sort of ways to write and distribute and share my work. And so that meant, writing in multimedia, using sound, using motion graphics, using animation, just exploring different ways that I could use technology to make my poetic language come off the page and do different things than it's able to do in the conventional printed form. And that was sort of one track that led me to blockchain, because you can't publish multimedia work as a physical book. So I was really hungry for and seeking opportunities to keep kind of pushing that multimedia mode of writing, of authorship forward. And blockchain seemed like a really, natural and organic way to do that. So that was a really exciting moment. And, as for the AI piece of it, we could probably get into that later as well. But that's really been an organic journey as well, that has grown out of my lifelong fascination with technology and transhumanism, and sort of thinking about where technology is leading us, and this question of using poetry to sort of think through, what does it mean to be human in this world that is increasingly filled with non-human and more than human intelligences.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for covering this. And so I will be sharing my screen once again to share your website and to give our audience an understanding of your work. So I'm quite sure they're all familiar with it. But in general, you actually have a lot of medias here. You also use AI. But in general, if we are talking about your creative process, can you guide us step by step on how you create your artworks?
Sure, and thanks for sharing that website. It is a good place, I think, for kind of an overview. Well, I would say, I've had a long time art practice, and it incorporates physical work as well. So there's a lot to sort of, I guess, discuss. But really, I think, to sort of keep it focused, everything comes back to language and comes back to poetry, and really is rooted in language, is rooted in words. And I think a lot about, words, both as an art form, how language kind of started in a pictorial mode, how language really began as an image and has sort of evolved into something else. I also often think about language, as a kind of technology in and of itself. And I do consider language, a kind of code. I think about poems as programming language, as code that we use to sort of evoke emotion or to trigger memories and things like that. So I think everything is sort of rooted in those two kind of ideas, and it really just manifests in different ways. I think, I like to write in a transdisciplinary way. I like to sort of think about using different mediums, different materials to express different ideas, sometimes even to take the same poem or the same line of poetry and explore it through different mediums. So for example, I might take a line of poetry that I think is, a line of AI generated poetry, for example, that has to do with nature and technology. And I might translate that into physical eco elements, as I've done in a project called Analog Binary Code, where I'm actually translating human language into binary code, into machine speak, but I'm doing it in physical objects that I find out in nature. So things like, nuts and leaves and twigs and fruits and things like that. So that's sort of like one end of the spectrum, is to kind of experiment with and explore the materiality of language, the physicality of language, in that way. And sort of on the other spectrum, yeah, exactly. Thank you for pulling that up. So those are some examples there from this Analog Binary Code series, which is really sort of a techno-biological language project. So there's that. And actually, that I'm thinking about that one a lot today, because Elena, as I mentioned to you before I jumped on this chat, I'm actually I'm not in my studio today because we've had a power outage, and I live in the countryside, so it's a pretty frequent thing for us to lose power and lose internet and electricity. But that was actually one of the one of the, motivations, I guess, to start coding with natural objects was to think about, this funny duality that we have between this, this existence that's really dependent on electricity, dependent on technology, but at the same time, when we lose that, we still have to kind of keep going. We still have to figure out, how to communicate and how to be human. So it kind of grew out of that moment of, of not having, the electricity and the currency at our disposal. So anyway, that's sort of one side of it. And then to go kind of maybe to the other extreme, I do a lot of projects where I'm taking language, whether it's human language or computer generated language, and I'm using code, I'm using digital tools to then publish it and explore it and, augment it. So, for example, I recently published a collection of 4 poems earlier this year that's written with AI, that's sort of illustrated and animated and visualized using AI, that's turned into a spoken word performance using artificial intelligence, trained on my own human recordings to kind of create a chorus of AI voice clones that can, speak my poetry with me and also without me. So things like that, where I'm really leaning into the technologies, and I really want to see how all of the tools that I have at my fingertips can enable me to push my practice as a poet and artist, can enable me to continue to explore dimensions of literature that might not be possible without using these tools. So it really does run the gamut. But I think that's what's interesting to me as an artist is really kind of exploring both the viscerality of human experience and the virtuality of human experience in this moment that we're in, which is really characterized by, by the digital condition.
And so I know you describe yourself as a generative literature artist pioneer, and may check. So the second part you've been referring to, where you use AI, you train AI to create poems. Is this the generative literature? How would you in general define this term? And step by step on how to explore this medium for everyone who is curious out there.
Sure. So so generative literature is a really interesting arena for me. So I guess to step back for a second, I've studied literature my whole life, and I actually like to think that, as much as I'm interested in thinking about and writing towards the future of language, I'm also incredibly interested in the history of language. And I've started actually by studying the classics when I was a student. I studied Latin, and specifically was focusing on ancient poetry. And I really love to sort of think back to some of those earlier traces of human imagination and think about why it is that poems that were written thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, why those things are still so relevant to us, and how they can continue to generate such vivid and strong emotions in us, even though they are very old. These artifacts of different times and different minds. So, I like to think about this longer trajectory, I think, of human language, and look at AI as a piece of that story. So going back to the beginning, I'm very, I think a lot about how poetry has its roots in orality, in spoken word, in the oral tradition. And I like to think a lot about how the storytellers who were creating language in that time, in the time of oral tradition, were actually generative artists as well. If you think about it, and I've done a lot of reading and sort of studying about this, when those oral storytellers were performing for an audience, they were taking kind of the code, or the program, or the script for a story. They were taking a narrative, they were taking characters and plot points, and they were then sort of generating a new version of the story for each audience they performed for. And I think that that for me is a pretty interesting thought. It just kind of puts generativity in a different context than we sometimes think about it now. So that's one touchstone for me. And, then I think about how orality gave rise to the birth of written language and the invention of the printed text, and how that allowed us to generate texts, to generate language, to generate literature in a much different way, to print information at speed and scale, and to distribute information to people in a way that we'd never been able to do before. And that was also, a kind of generativity, where technology enabled us to sort of become a different kind of storyteller, a different kind of author in a way. And now I really enjoy thinking about how generative text, how AI-powered large language models are kind of taking all this and pushing us further and further into, a new territory, but one that is sort of, we've been led to by this path that we're on, this path of linguistic innovation over time. So for me, large language models and natural language processing, as I said before, are really my areas of interest when it comes to AI. And natural language processing, just as like a quick, I guess, background or overview, is an area of AI that really has to do with the intersection of these intelligent systems and linguistics and computer science. And it's all about creating systems that are able to understand and create human language or human sounding speech. And, as someone who writes for a living, I've always been really interested in this idea that machines can, in some ways, write language that sounds human, or they can write things that we understand. And so that's been sort of the basis of a lot of my work and a lot of my research. So when it comes to the work that I do, I tend to, to kind of reach for NLP as kind of the underlying material, the underlying tool, the underlying technique or approach that really helps me, create language in different ways. So I often will start by using a large language model that is really readily available. So I think a lot of us now are very familiar with things like ChatGPT. When I started really working with these systems in earnest, long before the pandemic, I was using GPT-2, which is sort of the predecessor of things like ChatGPT. But I was using this large language model that essentially, is built by absorbing many, many, many examples of human text and then sort of parsing it and, sifting through it and learning from those examples some of the foundational rules of how humans communicate with one another. And then I was taking these existing models and going a step further and doing something called fine-tuning them, which, again, like I think the kind of the awareness around it and the ability to do this has changed quite a lot, even in just the past 2 years. But when I started to do this in 2018 and 2019, I was creating data sets really based on my own writing, based on drafts of poems that I'd written, based on manuscripts for my first book that were then being developed and edited and constantly revised. And I was taking all this information and I decided to put it all into one sort of, one training file, one set of information to essentially mentor this underlying model in my style of poetry, in how I like to write, and how I like to form language, the kinds of words that I like to use, the kinds of metaphors and poetic devices that I reach for. And so it was a combination of this underlying model that really has this expansive, vast knowledge of the human written record, and then combining that with my very personalized, my very individualized point of view as a human writer. And using those two things together is really the basis for all the generative literature that I write. And in a way, it really has made sense for me because it's kind of how I think humans write as well. Like, we're all sort of trained in canonical literature. We learn the rules of grammar and syntax and things like that. We learn how to write, sort of by studying examples. And then we have our own lived experience. We have memories. We have personal stories that we want to tell, and we combine that with that learned knowledge, and that's how we find our own voices as writers. So I think for me, this approach with generative literature has sort of been a way of mirroring my own kind of development as a writer, and using what I know about the craft of writing to understand AI and this kind of new technology a little bit better from the point of view of language and authorship.
Thank you so much. You touched a lot of topics, and you've been talking about changing your story according to the readers who would end up reading it. And I also feel like you are the best person to know the power of language. And you had a lot of amazing speeches and panels during Art Basel Miami, and in general Art Basel. And so, considering all of this, your expertise on this, what would be your tip for everyone who is doing a public speech, who is a little bit anxious about it? How should they think about their audience, and how should they develop their speech according to the audience's needs? Maybe you have some tips regarding it.
Oh, that's such a good question. And yes, I have really nice memories of some of those events in Miami, including the one that you organized there, which was really lovely to be part of. So thank you for that. Yeah, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of traveling over the past few years, especially, and to speak to a lot of different audiences in a lot of different environments and events about language and art and technology and AI. And it's always a little different because sometimes the context is more focused on art. Sometimes it's more focused on the technology of it. Sometimes I'm talking to a group of writers. For example, if I'm at a literary conference, and the audience there is really made up of people who are very interested more in the craft of authorship and things like that. So the first thing I think for me is to always consider the audience, to consider who you're speaking to, and to sort of put yourself in their shoes a little bit, or to put yourself in their mindset, and just sort of think about what it is that they might be bringing into this conversation or this dialogue. Like what might their questions be? What might their experiences, with these subjects be? What might they be really curious about? And then also, what do they maybe not know about that I might be able to sort of offer? Bring something a little bit new to their understanding of these subject areas. So I think much like those oral storytellers that I was referencing earlier, it really starts, I think, with that consideration of who are you speaking with? Who are you talking to? Who are you writing for? And just trying to be really aware of that. And I think, again, that's something that a lot of writers do, I think, in our craft and in our practice as well. We always kind of think, who is our reader? Even if it's something, where we're kind of imagining our ideal reader, or if we're sort of thinking about one person that we hope will read a poem or a story or a text, I think there is something really helpful and valuable about not trying to tell a general story, not trying to say everything to everyone, but try to really hone in on how you can communicate, how you can express something meaningful, how you can impart some useful information to a particular group of people, or even just to a particular person. So, just as an example, when I was in Art Basel, or when I speak at art fairs, I'm asked a lot about creative AI, kind of in that zone, right? Like, what does creative AI mean in this art world? Like, how can AI be a creative tool? Can it really help sort of be imaginative, or is it sort of replicating or stealing from artists? And I know that those questions will come up. So I often, when I go into those environments, I want to talk a little bit about creativity and AI, and I want to really talk about how the history of art and the history of creativity is sort of the history of artistic dialogue and collaboration and influence, and how inspiration, always comes from this two-way or multi-way discussion between artists, both, your contemporaries, your peers, but also artists that you are referencing, from past generations, from different movements throughout history. So that's an example where, I know in that kind of an environment, it's probably going to be useful to talk about AI within the history of the artistic canon, within the history of art traditions, and kind of invoking this idea of the anxiety of influence, which is something that I think a lot of artists, as well as, writers and poets, think about, versus if I'm going to, let's say, a tech conference, then it might be more interesting to sort of present my point of view as a poet who's really kind of digging deep into the inner workings of a fine-tuned large language model and kind of thinking through some of the structural and technical and logistical applications as far as it comes to crafting language. So I always kind of vary it up in that way. And I think that would be my best advice for anyone who is looking to do those kinds of presentations as well.
Thank you so much. And so this is to your previous answer before. You've been talking about developing a model, an AI model that would kind of duplicate the points that you would create it yourself. So in a way, humanizing what the AI outcome will be. And in this way, I was curious if, for example, you and AI would separately create something, would you think that for readers who are familiar with your texts, would they be able to differentiate AI texts and your text in a way? Is there a point where you want AI to be so similar to the text that you can create? I'm sorry, my talk is going
okay.
crazy.
No, it's cute to hear. It's nice to hear your dog there too. That's a great question. And I think the answer is that it sometimes changes. But one of the reasons that that I was really interested in working with AI was not so much to replicate my own voice, but to sort of create a new voice that is inspired, I guess, a bit by my own, that is shaped a bit by my own, but that it's also doing things that I wouldn't have thought to do. It's taking, my poetry to places that I wouldn't be able to go on my own, or is sort of surprising me with new ways of writing, or, new words, or new kind of metaphorical images and things like that. So I often really want to create enough space for this AI model to do things that are a little bit unexpected, and to sort of, defy my programming, or sort of challenge what it's learned and actually do something different. Because I think that's, first of all, that's interesting to me. I know how to write in my own style, and using AI is a little bit of a way of getting out of my own head and trying to, push my practice further, expand the bounds of what I consider to be good poetry. So I think there's that piece of it. And it's also that, when I'm writing with an AI model, I'm tapping into a huge body of knowledge, including lots of texts and lots of, biographies, lots of voices, lots of personalities, lots of lived experiences that I myself have not had. And I think that that's something that I find really exciting as well, is to think about how AI might enable more of a collaborative mode, or might enable a poet like me, or any author, to almost distill, universal human experience in different ways. And so I'm also wanting to leave some room for that to come through, right? That it's not just my lived experience. It's, more like, how do I, as one human on this planet of billions of humans, how does my story interweave with other stories and other voices? How can it sort of be part of this polyphonic conversation? So I think that's, that's something that's important to me, is both to have threads of this generative poetry that do feel like they are coming from me and my years of practice, and the ideas and the things that I've written and put out into the world on the one hand, but to also have that space for this augmented imagination to go even further, and to dream up things that, wouldn't have ordinarily found their way into my poem, or maybe even into any human poem. I think that kind of exploration and an adventure, that linguistic adventure, is a really important part of, why I do what I do. But at the same time, there are, I would say that these large language models in general are built, to be very reliable collaborators, to be very reliable in terms of the responses that they're generating, right? And again, when I started working with them, they were a little bit less predictable. They were less reliable. You might get something back that was more surprising. And now, several years later, a lot of these systems have gotten much more refined. They're much better at, doing things that a company might want them to do, that, the corporate world might want to put them into use doing, like responding to customer service inquiries or generating product copy for a website, or all these kinds of things that really, are use cases for what these big models are being engineered to do. And so I think part of this is really kind of understanding how that training works, the connection between how a model sort of learns what it's supposed to do, and then how it executes on that task. And then kind of working back from that to say, okay, well, I want this model to actually write something surprising and beautiful and poetic. And that means breaking some of the rules of language. And that means subverting some of the things that we might predict or that it might, think that it's supposed to do. So in that case, you kind of work backwards and you want to program a little bit of that openness or that kind of unpredictability into the model in different ways. And I think that's, for me, that's also part of the fun, because that requires me to be writing different things. It requires me to be collaborating with the AI to sort of, create an underlying model that is doing something a bit different than, what you might give it in order to do something like much more predictable, much more, like prose, I guess, right? Poetry is a very different animal than prose. And so I think you do want to leave room, for a voice to come through that maybe is a little unfamiliar or that is a little uncanny. And so I really enjoy kind of feeling my way through that process. And some of the moments that I like the most are when the voice that comes through this generator are maybe familiar, but are echoing in slightly uncanny ways, or that, maybe are taking an idea that I've had, but are distorting it or pushing it to a place I wouldn't have thought to take it. So I like the tension, I think, between those two things. And that's kind of what I'm always striving for, which is also why I tend to think about this as an alter ego. It's me, but it's also not me in that way. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And so the next question is quite like harsh, because I feel like I'm about to ask you what's your perspective on the future of AI and literature, like this combination. But in general, I feel like it's a little bit hard to predict the future of literature, because you actually like to do so. You have to actually predict the future in general. But how do you feel how AI would intersect in this type of form? And in general, I'm even thinking, would it be allowed in schools for students to use AI to generate something? But in general, what are your thoughts on the future of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, as you're saying, it's like quite an open-ended question too, because there's so many different ways to go, and we're still so early on in this. But I mean, I think, AI is such an incredibly powerful tool to help us not just create things, not just generate things, but to really learn and to kind of understand in new ways. And, I think that it's a really promising resource for students, for schools, for educational environments as well. So, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of exploration that we all have to do in terms of how best to use it and what kind of guardrails maybe to put around it. But I think that, it's incredibly powerful, and kind of figuring out the best way to make use of it is again, one of the reasons why I'm doing what I do and why I enjoy talking to other people who are in this field as well. I think, in some of my projects, I've used these AI tools to, again, like not just sort of, write something, but to sort of take in a large amount of information and to sift through it and to kind of look at it in different ways. So one concrete example of this was a project that I did with Diverse Verse and the estate of Allen Ginsberg, who's a really, legendary poet who I think is someone that most writers, most students of literature feel we know in some way, feel we recognize, but maybe don't actually know that much about beyond a handful of really famous poems. And so for this particular project, which was called After Ginsberg, we, just the short version of it is that we were using AI to ingest various texts about Ginsberg, texts that Ginsberg had written, essays about him, information about him, creating a fine-tuned model that was really kind of trained and mentored on Ginsberg's life and his community and his influences, and then using this model to then sort of look at Ginsberg's work and to generate analyses of it, to generate poems in response to various pieces from his body of work. And it was a way to sort of, I think, begin to understand him through slightly different lenses and kind of, give us an opportunity to see things about his work or think about aspects of his work that might not have been apparent otherwise. And so I think, AI can do that in lots of ways. It can really bring things to the surface that might be hidden. It can sort of help, suggest areas to focus in on that might not otherwise be that obvious to us. It's a way of sort of seeing things that might otherwise have been like very obscure or very abstract. So I think that makes it a really powerful tool. And I think, in schools and especially for people like me who, went to school studying literature, studying novels and poetry and creative writing, it's a really interesting thing to be able to look at a text and read a text using systems like this, in addition to all the other things we have at our disposal. And it's just, another way of, I think, enabling really like incisive, really close engagement with a text. So I think that piece of it is also very important. Not just about, using AI to like write an essay or something like that. It can also be used for all sorts of really, really kind of beautiful and I guess under the radar, techniques and approaches as well. So that part of it is really important to me. I think that going forward, the rise of AI is so transformative. I think, this whole broad arena of technology, which has been developing for many decades now, not just the past few years, it's really been many years, many decades in the making, is sort of a new way of expressing ourselves and a new way of understanding ourselves. I often, think about the connection between language and consciousness and language and self-awareness throughout human history. I think we often, sort of associate the development of human consciousness with the beginning of art making and language making for that reason. And so I think, this seismic moment that we're in, where we're able to use language to generate new language, to create images that we've never seen before, to understand our data in new ways, all the things that AI can do. I think it's continuing that evolution of consciousness in a way. And to me, I think, again, like when I think about the future of language, that's why, again, AI for me is such an intricate part of it, such a deeply embedded part of it, because it really is more than a tool. It's more than a gadget. It's sort of, more than like a subfield. It really is this very kind of foundational element of, of what it means to be human, which is, it's something that helps us, speak to one another and, think, and it helps us sort of perceive things in new ways. So to me, it really is almost like a new kind of, I don't know, sensory organ that's developing or evolving in real time. And just as, all these previous linguistic innovations have also allowed us to kind of keep evolving as sentient, beings, and to see and feel and think and do new and different things, I feel like that is where we're headed with AI as well. We're going to be able to continue to sort of perceive new things, think about things in different ways, maybe experience the world around us with different emotions, different feelings, different understandings. And that is sort of inextricably woven together with the future of language and the future of humanity as well, in my eyes.
Thank you so much. That's a perfect answer. And so, can you share your tips for artists? And it's kind of a broad question because I'm curious, what would be your tips for the emerging artists and also people who are writing poems and are kind of want to take it further and add technology component to this, to just normal regular writing as we saw it before, and I think you had this moment in your life when you kind of implemented technology, and so yeah, what would those tips be?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking that, because one of the really big joys of being in this space has been being able to have these kinds of conversations with writers and artists who have not used these tools before, but who are maybe interested in them. And so it's been great to sort of have opportunities to help onboard these writers and see what they can do, see what they do after they, sort of become familiar with these tools. It's actually one of the really wonderful things about, creating, co-creating this space, this community of the verse, where I was able to really kind of bring a lot of my work with generative text and AI into the fold. And it's been really, really meaningful to kind of see what that has sparked, and to see how many writers and artists have sort of become interested, or have become, I guess, more open to experimenting with AI kind of as a result of that. So it's like a very near and dear thing to my heart. But I think that, like, maybe the first thing is to really just play with the tools, play with the variety of tools, because there are so many out there right now, and there's so many different ways to utilize them. And I think it's really up to each artist or each writer to kind of figure out how they want to incorporate this into their work. And the only way to do that is just through, adventure and experimentation and play. So when I started, I really was most interested in using language itself as a material. And so I was using text generators. And then over time, there were new tools that popped up, like DALL-E 2 and text to image and all these things. And, my practice has sort of grown and shifted over time as these new tools have become available. And I've sort of decided, okay, I want to try this. I want to see this. I want to, experiment and see, does this feel like a natural extension of my voice? Does it feel like it's something that I want to work with? Or does it feel like something that maybe doesn't make sense with my practice or with my craft or approach? And so I think, like, that's a good way to go probably for anyone who's newer to the tools, is just to kind of try different things, use your trial credits at various platforms, and get a sense of what you want to do. I think for writers specifically, one of my favorite platforms is a platform called Sudowrite, and it's spelled SUDO WRITE, in a nod to like pseudo code, pseudo commands. And it was co-created by a couple people who I'm happy to call friends, James Yu and Amit Gupta, and who are really just very innovative minds, innovative thinkers in the realm of generative text. And it's a whole platform that's really dedicated to making the tools of artificial intelligence, of these large language models, available to creative writers. And it's a really kind of great, pretty prescriptive interface that allows you to input information. It allows you to kind of put text in and play with it the way that you'd manipulate, an image in Photoshop. You can kind of tweak the tone of your text, or, change the plot of a short story, things like that. You can kind of take seeds for a potential poem and use their poem plugin to, to kind of elaborate on an idea and turn it into a more fully fleshed out piece of writing. And I think that's a really good place to start for a lot of writers. It might be something where, you get to a point where you then want to do something, a little bit more self-directed, or you want to integrate other tools, things like text to image or text to speech, or, music or voice elements and stuff like that. But I do think that for writers in particular, it's a really fun place to start, because it kind of opens up your eyes to all the different ways in which you can be really creative with language, and do things that are really sort of, personal and unique, and inspired, enabled by artificial intelligence. And it kind of shows you it's not just about pressing a button and having like a generic text pop out. It's really about being a collaborator with technology and, co-writing something together that can be really fresh and unique and beautiful and, full of soul and emotion. So that's often a place where I recommend, if I have friends, poets or writers or others who, really just want to get like a feel for the possibilities of what AI can do for their practice, that's a good place to go. ChatGPT is like a very sort of generic, really good, robust place to go just to kind of test things out. But a tool like Pseudo-Write, an interface like that, I think really starts to give a better sense of what you can really do as a creative person with these tools at your disposal. And I recommend that as a good place to start. And it's actually the place where, I early on with the Verse, when we created our Gen Text project series, we brought on Pseudo-Write as our technical advisors, and invited our poets and artists to use this tool as a place to start. And we were so excited and impressed by the results. And it's spawned a lot of really beautiful projects, and has gotten a lot of artists and poets who hadn't used AI. It's gotten them very excited about the possibilities.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming today and for sharing all of this. I really love your answers. They're covering it all. And this would be like the final question for today. I'm super curious to find out what is up for you next. Can you hint us on some upcoming projects you're working on? And in general, just hint us on the future and what can we expect.
Well, yeah, thank you again so much for having me. It's really lovely to be in conversation with you, and I appreciate all of your great questions, and hope that I've answered them okay. But coming up next, I have a pretty busy rest of the year with various projects. I guess the few that I would mention are, one is I'm very honored to be part of the first exhibition of digital art at a new museum opening in the United States called the Museum of Art and Light. And we're getting ready for an exhibition that opens in the fall. So I'm working very hard on that, and I'm really excited because it's going to be an opportunity, I think, to bring digital art to a region and to an audience that might not have had the chance to experience this kind of digital art before, especially when it comes to things like generative art and AI. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully the conversations that will open up, and that's just the dialogue that it might spur in these areas. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm also preparing to head over to Linz for Ars Electronica, which is, of course, like this, this wonderful festival that celebrates, all kinds of digital creativity, and bringing a poem there and installing it as a special sort of exhibition during the run of the festival at the Lentos Museum in Linz. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm working on that exhibition plan right now. And then, working on actually a really exciting AI commission with a really interesting company that I can't quite talk about yet, but I've been working on this for a few months now, and I'm kind of in the development stage at the moment. And this project will I think, be the start of some really exciting new installations, but centers ultimately on taking my AI alter ego technology and installing this alter ego as a poet in residence, and really kind of looking at what that can mean to have an AI poet sort of in-house in an environment, sort of responding to things in real time, and sort of performing, for me or as me, even when I can't be there. So that's something that I'm really happy to be working on, and it's kind of inspiring a lot of related projects and all that will be coming out in 2025. But yeah, that's just like, I guess, a handful of the things I'm working on at the moment. Thank you for asking about them.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I feel like July is super busy for you, and I really hope to see all of your updates, the upcoming poem, the upcoming exhibition, the commission. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us, for finding time. I know your schedule is like super tight. I feel like this webinar was really different from the previous ones we had because we explored something like completely new. And yeah, thank you again so much for your artworks, your personality, and for joining us today. And have an amazing week of July and keep us tuned on everything.
Thank you so much for all the kind words, and it's always my pleasure to talk with you. Again, thank you for the invite, and I was really happy to make some time. And yeah, hope to see you in person again at some point soon. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen as well.
Bye.